Alrighty, yo, what is going on, everybody? It's your boy, Mr. DDG94, back with another reaction video. Today we're going to react to what was gaming like in 2004. Man, 2004, we all know what 2004 gave us. It gave us NBA Ballers, NFL Street 2, Grand Theft Auto, Halo. Gave us a whole gang of games back in 2004, man. 2004 is a golden year for video games, man. So without further ado, man, let's get right into it, man. Let's go back through it.
2004 was 20 years ago. Most of us were probably kids at that time. So
oh yeah, SpongeBob came out.
So let's take a trip
movie
down memory lane and look at what was honestly a really crazy year for gaming. Before we get into the nitty gritty of the hot game releases in 2004, let's start with the console stuff. This was the year that Nintendo launched the Game Boy Advance Video, which was a line of Game Boy Advance cartridges with episodes of TV shows and even full movies. These movies looked
Y'all was really watching TV shows and movies on the Game Boy.
At the time, it was
fuck out of
cool
here
to have episodes
Get
of
a
some of your
PSP,
favorite shows on the
loser.
go right there on your GBA. And there were quite a number of shows that had Game Boy Advance Video cartridges, like Pokemon, SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron, Ed, and Eddie, and even The Proud Family. In terms of movies, the only feature-length films that were released on
get a
Game Boy Advance
PSP.
Video were Shrek, Shrek 2, and Shark Tale. Yeah, remember that one? Speaking of the Game Boy Advance, this year also saw the release of the GBA wireless adapter, which allowed multiple GBAs to connect to each other for multiplayer wirelessly, whereas before you needed a GBA link cable. There was one pretty big downside to the wireless adapter though, which was that you could only use the wireless adapter with games that were designed to be compatible with it. In practice, what this meant was that if a game was made before the wireless adapter's release, it most likely didn't have support for the adapter, meaning you'd need to use the GBA link cable for multiplayer. But that's enough about the GBA. Let's get to the big Nintendo console news of this year. This year was the release of the Nintendo DS, Nintendo's newest handheld console, which was first unveiled in a prototype form at
DS,
E3 2004. This console's release was quite strange considering only 3 years prior, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance, which was supposed to be their next generation handheld console. Even stranger is that only 1 year prior in 2003, they released their new and improved Game Boy Advance model, the Game Boy Advance SP, which had a new clamshell design which could protect your screen, a rechargeable battery that removed the need to buy multiple batteries, and a front-lit screen allowing you to see the game easier. Another weird thing about the DS is that Nintendo initially marketed it not as a replacement for the Game Boy Advance, but instead as a third console in their line of systems along with the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. Some people believe that Nintendo did this because they weren't entirely sure if the DS would be a success. The DS was an odd console. It has 2 screens instead of 1, with the bottom one being a touchscreen, and it also had a built-in microphone for some reason. But the DS did have some legitimately great features at the time, like built-in wireless connectivity to connect with other systems using Wi-Fi, allowing for online play over the internet. Another great feature it had was that it was backwards compatible with Game Boy Advance games, which made the idea that it wasn't a successor to the Game Boy Advance that much more stupid. Of course, there were still some reasons to own a GBA, since the DS couldn't play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, and the DS didn't allow for Game Boy Advance multiplayer. Even if Nintendo was concerned about whether the DS would be popular or not, their worries were in vain because the Nintendo DS was a smash hit. It became popular thanks to its plethora of casual games with universal appeal. It is still to this day Nintendo's most popular console of all time, selling over 150 million units. But Nintendo wasn't the only company to release a portable console this year. This year was also the release of Sony's handheld, the PlayStation Portable. And like Nintendo, Sony showed off this console at E3 2004. Sony had already successfully ripped the home console market from Nintendo's clutches, so I guess they figured they could do the same thing with the handheld market. And to be fair, the PSP had some great benefits, like a wide screen for better viewing, some pretty powerful components for a handheld console at the time, allowing for pretty impressive 3D visuals, and the ability to download games off of the internet using Sony's new PlayStation Network, although that feature came a few years later. But not only was the PSP a great gaming console, it was also a great multimedia device. This thing had the ability to play music, watch videos, and even browse the internet. The PSP did have its fair share of quirks, like the weird nub analog stick, the odd decision to use optical discs for games instead of cartridges, and of course, Sony deciding to use their own proprietary storage device for saving data, the memory stick. All in all though, the PSP was a massive success for Sony. This console had a ton of RPGs and entries from popular franchises on previous PlayStation consoles. The PSP ended up selling over 75 million units. It doesn't feel right to talk about Nintendo and Sony while leaving Microsoft Microsoft out. Microsoft didn't release a handheld this year or any new consoles at all, but what they did do was start their Xbox Live Arcade service. By going to Xbox.com and ordering a copy of the free Xbox Live Arcade disc, you could have access to the service. Xbox Live Arcade allowed Xbox owners to download simpler games to their Xbox like Miss Pac-Man, Joust, and Smash TV. The service would really become a big part of gaming on Microsoft's next console, the Xbox 360, but even on the original Xbox. Xbox Live Arcade was a pretty cute little service for old arcade games and other smaller titles. But now that we've gotten all of that stuff out of the way, let's move on to the main course of this video, the games. Looking back, I was surprised just how stacked 2004 was. Let's start with new entries and old franchises.
I forgot about Def
Game
Jam.
Freak gave us Pokemon Emerald, the third game in the new Generation 3 games that started 2 years prior with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Emerald is easily the best version of Gen 3, offering redesigns for the male and female protagonists, a reworked story that incorporates elements of the stories of both Ruby and Sapphire, a brand new post-game location with tons of new challenges, and plenty of other new features. Speaking of RPGs, the Paper Mario series got its second game this year, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. This game is a grail amongst Mario fans, GameCube fans, and RPG fans alike. It says a lot that its remake is one of the most hotly anticipated games I've seen in a while. Mario has never been known for its story, but the Thousand Year Door's narrative helped people realize that, yeah, you can tell a compelling story with memorable characters in a Mario game. While this series began on a Sony platform, another sequel that came out on a Nintendo platform this year was Kingdom Hearts: Chain of Memories on the Game Boy Advance. Kingdom Hearts for many years was infamous for all of its games being important to the overarching narrative and all of those games being released on a bunch of different consoles, and that trend began here with Chain of Memories. Kingdom Hearts has experimented with a ton of different mechanics over the years, but I still think Chain of Memories might be the most unique game in the series. It combines the series' trademark action RPG combat with a deck builder. All attacks in this game are done via cards. Each card has a number, and if you use a card that has a higher value than your enemy's card, you can cancel out their attack. I'd be here for a while if I went into all of the complexities of this game's battle system, but it's honestly really cool, and it's a shame that the game is frequently overlooked, even by some Kingdom Hearts fans. RPG fans were eating good this year with several new entries in old series, but first-person shooter fans were not starving for sequels this year either. 2004 saw the release of Halo 2, which launched with online play allowing you to play against other people over the internet. Doom 3, which brought back arguably the most influential first-person shooter franchise in history back into the mainstream, and of course, Half-Life 2. There's another first-person shooter Valve game that came out this year that's rather notable, Counter-Strike Condition Zero. This game was the first game to have its initial launch on Valve's Steam service. Steam would end up becoming a juggernaut in the online game distribution sphere, with thousands of games released for it every single year. Some of the other new titles in old franchises were GTA San Andreas, which is a masterclass in open-world games. There's also Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which is still considered by many fans to be the best game in the series, Burnout 3 Takedown, which is a super zany over-the-top fun racing game, and Silent Hill 4 The Room, the last game to be made by the original creators of the series, Team Silent. While not brand new games, there were quite a few remakes this year, like Metroid Zero Mission, a GBA remake of the first Metroid game on the NES. It took many of the improvements from games like Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion and added them into the original game, as well as some brand new stuff to spice things up. There was also a new duo of Pokemon games, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, which came bundled with the aforementioned GBA wireless adapter. These games are remakes of the original first generation of Pokemon games on the Game Boy. I remember as a kid I tried to play Pokemon Blue and I just couldn't get into it. The game just visually was not very interesting due to the limited colors and primitive sprites. A lot of the locations looked very similar to one another, and I didn't like how the Pokemon didn't have unique sprites in the menus. I just wasn't a fan. But when I played Pokemon Fire Red, I had a great time. My first experience with Pokemon was watching the 1998 anime, so getting to catch all of my favorite Pokemon from the show in full color with updated sprites, mechanics, and features was amazing. The PS1 classic Metal Gear Solid got a remake on the GameCube this year with Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, featuring greatly improved graphics, re-recorded dialogue, new cutscenes to flesh out the story, and new mechanics added to the game from the previously released Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. There was also Super Mario 64 DS, a remake of the classic N64 game Super Mario 64. This was my first experience with Mario 64, and while I don't go back to this one as much as the original because of the small screen and lack of analog controls, it still is pretty cool since you can play as different characters other than Mario who each have their own special moves and abilities. Speaking of remakes, I should also mention some re-releases of old games, notably Nintendo's classic NES series, which was a series of re-releases of old NES games on the GBA. Of course, you had the ones everyone expects like Super Mario Bros., Zelda 1, and Metroid, but there were some pretty cool third-party releases like Castlevania, Bomberman, and Pac-Man. Okay, so we've talked about new games in old series, well, how about new games based on old intellectual properties, like licensed games? This year saw a number of great licensed games. Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3 refined the gameplay of the previous entries in the Budokai series, adding in several new characters, mechanics, and balance changes to become a legitimately good fighting game. There was also Star Wars Battlefront, a Star Wars first-person shooter that allowed you to take part in battles from all 6 of the Star Wars movies at the time. The SpongeBob movie game is an actually good movie tie-in game developed developed by Heavy Iron Studios, the same team that gave us the acclaimed SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom the previous year. The SpongeBob movie game has some great platforming challenges and fun level design that shouldn't be overlooked. And of course, this year also gave us another awesome movie tie-in, Spider-Man 2, one of the grails of licensed games thanks to its great web-slinging mechanic that actually requires a bit of skill to use, its inclusion of new material that wasn't in the movie to flesh out the game's story a bit more, and its open world, which was fairly impressive for its time. But that's enough about old games from existing franchises. Let's talk about the brand new series that started this year. Let's show Xbox some love and start with Fable. Xbox as a console line isn't well known for RPGs, but Fable was at one point one of their mainstay franchises. Probably Fable's most defining feature was its ability to choose between being a hero or a villain. Obviously nowadays such a binary alignment system is pretty unremarkable, but back in the day this was pretty cool. And being able to see how your actions affect the world around you, how other people treat you, and how your character looks is pretty awesome. Another big game that came out this year was Far Cry. This game plays quite a bit differently from the much more open-ended later games in the franchise, but it still has the fish out of water in a foreign country FPS gameplay that the series is known for. This year also gave us Killzone, the Sony exclusive series that everyone forgot. This series seemed like PlayStation's answer to Xbox's Halo, considering they were both futuristic military first-person shooters, but Killzone never had anywhere near the same impact that Halo did. Another shooter that came out this year was Red Dead Revolver, the first game in the popular Red Dead series, but instead of being an open-world game, it's a more straightforward third-person shooter. This year also had the zany and surreal Katamari Damacy, where you go around rolling everything you can find, including buildings, animals, and human beings into a ball. You can't forget everyone's favorite multiplayer monster slaying game franchise that started this year, Monster Hunter, which was one of the PS2 games that had online play. And last but not least, I can't not mention that this year saw the release of the most popular MMORPG of all time, World of Warcraft. If we look past all of the games from big-name established developers like Capcom and Rockstar, we'll also find that this year had a number of some of the first popular indie games, like the surreal dream adventure game Yume Nikki, the Metroidvania staple Cave Story, and the PS2 and GameCube updated version of the Flash game Alien Hominid. I think it's important to talk about how much of a big deal this release was. This was a Newgrounds online Flash game that got an official release on 2 of the big 3 home video game consoles. This was certainly a big step for the future of indie games. Of course, I didn't mention everything that happened this year, and I didn't talk about every game that came out in 2004. I didn't bring up The Sims 2, a sequel to the incredibly popular first Sims game that helped popularize the life sim genre. I didn't mention Def Jam Fight for New York, a fighting game with a roster of real-life musical artists who were signed to the Def Jam record label as characters, like Ludacris, Ice-T, and Snoop Dogg.
Snoop Dogg was never signed to Def Jam,
sir. Mirror, which was really interesting at the time since it was a multiplayer Metroidvania Kirby game. I haven't touched on Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, a unique action platformer that made use of these weird controller drums called the DK Bongos controller. And I didn't even comment on one of my personal favorite games from this year, WarioWare Touched, which made great use of the DS's features in its zany microgames. So hey, please feel free to let me know in the comments what games I didn't mention in this video. Sometimes I decide not to talk about certain topics because they'd ruin the flow of the video, sometimes I honestly just forget stuff, and sometimes there's really cool stuff that I did not know about at all. 2004 really was a phenomenal year for gaming. So many cool games, consoles, and events in gaming, and it was really fun to go back and remember how the gaming landscape was back then. Thanks for watching, y'all, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, man. Shout out to 2004, man. Just a good year overall, man. Just a feel good year. 2004 was a feel good year, man. So much greatness came out of that year, bro. Most definitely, man. But anyways, just gonna about do it for this one, man. I will see you all in the next video. Tell me what y'all think down in the comment section below. I'll get back to you. Till then, peace out.